Mike, thanks for joining us.
Oh, no. Thanks for having me. Who's us?
Impose, I guess.
Okay.
So I asked you here today because, well, I mean, Ferguson is the most recent thing to happen in the news that is obviously causing a lot of concern around the country.
Absolutely.
It points to a larger subject that I've been coming across lately, and that is the marginalization of everyone on the internet. It's something that's kind of been a little bit of a sticking point for me recently because I find that the BuzzFeed effect of the internet has found a way to basically classify us all as a race, a gender, an age, a sexuality, and I find that to be somewhat troubling. So that's why I figured I'd ask you here as a black guy.
Okay.
And I'm here as a white guy.
All right.
Because that's what we are on the internet. We're black guys and white guys.
It's also what we are in America. Pre-internet even.
Do you think it's worse now? Is it worse because things are so, I don't know, readily accessible?
I think it's stayed bad because there are a lot of conversations that America really doesn't want to have. And I think that true progress in terms of things trying to be post-racial, as they put it, is not going to happen until some of these conversations take place. And people really don't want to have them. I mean, historically, there's just very little precedent for a group of people this large being in a place not by their own will. From it to start with that kind of like contentious, negative relationship, it's supposed to like get good once, you know, okay, you guys aren't slaves anymore. Now it should just be all good. And I don't think that's the case.
I totally agree with what you're saying. And whenever I try to bring up the subject of should we change the discussion to economics, because we are in a capitalist economy. You know what I mean? And that's kind of where a lot of the slave relations stem from. Obviously, the inherent racism being one thing, but from, you know, it was free labor. We're still in this capitalist society. So at the risk of sounding a little bit naive, is it as simple as like changing who is the poor class in our economy? Because ultimately, if we're in a capitalist economy, there has to be a poor class.
To me, it comes down to free labor and a wealthy class of this country who got rich off of free labor. I'm not sure that really gets addressed. I don't know a way to give advantages necessarily either to even it out.
It seems as though in both races that the majority of the anger still swells from the poor communities. How do we start to change that dialogue from like black and white that I always see on the internet to like those of us who make under whatever amount of money?
The capitalist machine, the part of it that kind of works through the Republican Party in terms of like top-down messaging, like Koch brothers down messaging in terms of who they pay for, who they lobby for, who they make sure is in power. And the messages that come down, not only through the politicians, but also come down through the Republican talking heads, the Rush Limbaughs, the Glenn Becks. Those people are paid very well to like deliver a message in a very convincing way. A lot of the result of that message is to kind of like encourage poor white people to blame their problems on other groups. I would say if somehow that could be stopped, I think like, you know, that people might be able to see that there's a little bit more similarities.
And you see something like Ferguson where all these visceral emotions come out, and then once they're actually addressed, you know, you're going to hear a lot of dialogue probably about like, oh, this watershed moment of like when, you know, they laid down their arms and like people were like protesting peacefully, but as soon as the cameras are turned off, something tells me that Ferguson is going to go back to being Ferguson. There's still going to be a majority white police force, and there's going to be...
Yeah, Ferguson... I mean, I can see clearly that Ferguson, especially Ferguson's police department, is very flawed. I just couldn't imagine, like, if a group of people in mass is protesting you being the police, and you're trying to police that demonstration, like, first of all, that's already fucked.
Right.
And then you got to see that how you handle that is going to cause a ripple effect. You know, yesterday they put out the report, Mike Brown and supposedly some cigars he stole and this and that. To think that you can just say that and not address how he was murdered, something there is fucked up.
But the places that have those types of outbursts of violence, no matter what the community is, it is places where they set up basically extreme divisions between classes. Right. It does seem as though that is, again, a huge part of the issue. And it's almost as though there's still a certain sense of segregation that exists in our community. Do you think that's something that's, pardon the term, natural?
New York, what's kind of going on here, and what I see a lot of places, is like a new thing. You know, where the gentrification is happening rapidly and expansively. It's not just a few blocks, it's like entire boroughs, entire neighborhoods. It's hard to tell how that's going to end up.
Like, is it just a matter of, like, eventually the people that come into power are going to be raised on a different set of ideals than, say, our parents or our parents' parents?
I mean, I would say that when the baby boomer generation finally gets out of the way, a lot of things will change.
I know.
A lot of philosophies will change. People are a lot more educated, not just book educated, but experience educated these days. I think a big part of the divide that we experience socially in America, especially rural America, I think it's messaging. And you can kind of choose where you want them to direct their fear and anger. And, you know, for a lot of times it's easy to say black people. It's really easy to say black people.
Right. You're a touring musician. Yeah. What is it like when you go into areas that are not a city?
It can be scary sometimes. You go to certain gas stations and you see what people write on the walls, and it'll fuck you up. Every city I go to in the South, you know, to Charlotte and you know, Atlanta and you know, Jacksonville, Florida, like, you know, they're all fine in the city. You know what I mean? But yeah, like traveling in between, it can be very imposing. You know, not to completely stereotype,
right?
But just think that's the contrast, is that I have to be prepared to hear certain things.
Does anyone that's separated from people tend to be the most fearful of other people?
Absolutely.
I know firsthand, having grown up in a suburb, like that was, you know, the kids that always got in trouble were usually the black kids. And it wasn't, you know, and now I look back on it, back then it's almost like inherently you thought of like, oh, those are the bad kids. And it's like, no, it was basically like there was probably a lot of pent-up anger in them, but also the way it was dealt with was immediately, it was, you know, on a much smaller scale, but kind of like the Ferguson is like, there's one way you deal with like a white criminal, and then there's one way you deal with a black criminal.
I have to say too that, like, you know, there's a lot of work that needs to be done in the black community in terms of like people being more responsible, being more respectful. You know, a lot of the situations that happen do come from people, you know, quote unquote, misbehaving in a sense, and things escalate. Like I said, I don't think my community is healthy, and I think like, and that's why I go back to, I think that like how we got here and the things that have happened since, I think those are things that create kind of an unhealthy community, and I feel like we have to have those conversations among ourselves. We have to have a conversation with the dominant culture of like, how do we address this legacy, this history that I think has created this climate where, you know, sometimes there's some, you know, there's some black neighborhoods I'm not too comfortable in.
Like, it seems as though we're marginalizing. And again, this might be just my white guilt talking, because, you know, I didn't choose to be born a white male, but I seem to be the cause of many problems. I have to admit, I get frustrated when I see a lot of people I respect talking about subjects like Ferguson or other, you know, feminism, other topics that basically, and they use the blanket term of white men for the scourge of society, which I can understand, and I've done it myself. But I get angry when it's things like Ferguson, because I don't believe that those police officers or anyone that would be favoring that type of action is any white person I would want to be associated with. So my white person question would be, how can we change that dialogue to, instead of white and black, or, you know, misogynistic, not misogynist, how do we change it to just exactly that, like racist and non-racist. In my naive world, the idealist answer is that we align with those who have the same belief system. And I feel like we do that as an independent community, especially, you know, in the arts field and things like that. You don't see, it's not like we're separated by, and there are obviously certain sects that might be, but, you know, for the most part, it's like it's a community.
Right.
And how do we embrace that philosophy on a larger scale? And that's also pointing fingers at, you know, people who are very close to us, I feel like sometimes.
I think that part of when people say white men this, white men that, it's a lot of times when people say, you know, men in general are, I think those are responses to like minority groups who often live with the reality of being put in those grouped positions. I think that, like, you know, a lot of times black people say white people because in our culture, our experience is that one of us means all of us. We're always like having to deal with that. That, like, you know, when people, a lot of times when people, you know, encounter us, they don't encounter us based on our individuality. They encounter us based on their some experiences with people who look like us, or their imagined experience of people who look like us. And I think the same goes with women a lot. Mm-hmm. I think that is that's one of the big side effects of being like a minority group, or a group that is not the dominant group. You live that situation. You live having to represent all in your group all the time. And I think that when people say, you know, all men are pigs or all white people suck, it's reactionary to that. It's like trying to say something to even that playing field. Because ultimately where it has to get to is that we all are seen as individuals. And I think that has to happen first in the not dominant groups. Oh, okay, and this is my imagination, right? But I would say for the most part, I think that as a white male, for the most part, you aren't necessarily compared to all white men. It would probably be mostly just in terms of dealing with those other groups when their issues come up.
Right.
But for the most part, being in a dominant culture, the experience of it is that you are taken kind of as an individual. For the most part, right? If you're an asshole...
That should be the name of the interview.
Right.
For the most part.
they're gonna say, Derek's an asshole. You know what I mean?
Right.
But a lot of times what we have to deal with is that if I'm an asshole, then people think that I'm uppity or something, like some other cultural context of it, not just me as an individual. So I think that, like, when we get to that place where the dominant culture doesn't look at us as representing all, then that'll stop happening too, where people will say all white men. Because I think that, you know, our experience will be based on our individuality, and then we can start to look at y'all's experience in terms of being individuals too.
Like, it's weird to even look at things from a cultural perspective. And when your culture is being white, it's almost frustrating to be like, well, why can't I be one of the rich white people, you know? Like,
absolutely.
But I think that's an interesting way of putting it. Let me ask you this question then. Do you take white rappers less seriously?
No, I don't. There are things that white rappers can do very quickly to make me not take them seriously. But I don't take them less seriously in general. You know, Paul Barman, man, is one of my favorite rappers of all time. Like, and a big reason why, aside from the fact that he values some of the same things I value in terms of the craft of rapping, is the fact that, like, he's never tried to be anything except for who he is a Jewish guy.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? He's that is his experience. He's a smart guy, a Jewish guy, you know, a guy who's had a guy who's had varying luck with women, you know what I mean? And all of that is central and front and center in his representation of himself.
Yeah.
And that's all I want from any rapper. You know what I mean? So, like, that's what I say, one of the first things a white rapper can do to turn me off is to, like, use some other voice that he thinks maybe he wants to sound blacker, or you know what I mean? That's the thing that I don't like. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, I'd rather just everybody kind of do their own individual thing, and I think that helps lead to the individuality that I'm looking to be valued.
And I think the point you make is pretty valid, because I think it's, you know, it's, again, the old trope of like, think global, act local. You know, if you think about it in terms of like how you can handle yourself as an individual, and then how you treat those others, and, you know, just realizing that we're all going to have to deal with assholes in our life at some point.
Right. So everybody should have the space to be able to express their own unique experience.
Well, thank you, Mike.
Thank you.
I appreciate it.
I appreciate it too, man. That was great.
Yeah, that was a fun conversation.
Yeah, man.
I would like to be able to do this more often.
Yeah, man. I'm always down. I guess I hope nothing terrible happens where we have to.
Yeah, I know. keep addressing these circumstances.
You know what I mean?
Well, thanks again.
Thank you.